Hey there, folks. So welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about the newest album from Green Day, called Revolution Radio. And there were some of you who thought I wasn't going to cover this album. In truth, I wasn't about to miss covering a new Green Day album for the world, even though I would make the argument that I've got a significantly complicated relationship with this band. Like most people of my age, I gravitated towards American Idiot in the mid-2000s, but as those of you who saw my review with John over at ARTV on his channel, the album that really won me over on Green Day was 21st Century Breakdown, a glorious over-the-top rock opera that was scattershot lyrically and about the furthest thing from raw punk music, but was too damn catchy for me to resist and ultimately has aged a lot better than some other Green Day albums I could mention. And from there, I went backwards. I dug into the early 90s Green Day albums that set the stage, including the album Kerplunk, which with its sharp songwriting and the drop tune grooves probably remains my favorite of their earlier years. Their work throughout the mid to late 90s, I don't really hate it by any stretch, but I definitely get why it took American Idiot to reignite some of the sharper creative spark and the more grandiose ambition. Even though I did really love some of the weirder twists on Warning, like Misery, that album at least tried to tell more stories, which I think is an undersold element that comes in Green Day. I wish they told more stories overall. But then 2012 happened. Those of you who read my blog can go back and find those 3 reviews that I wrote for Green Day's triple release Uno, Dos, and Tres in the fall of that year, but suffice to say, it did not go well. And while I will admit I wasn't exactly a great writer back then, I also went back to revisit the albums for the purpose of this review, and that was a mistake. It's not that there weren't a few good songs scattered across them, but the bad and especially the bland outweighed a lot of the good, and it really should have just been compressed into one great album instead of 3 mediocre to bad ones. But one of the most damning criticisms was that the trilogy, it made Green Day look and sound out of touch and disconnected, not just with the youth that's always been their audience, but of the social and political issues of that day. That could have made some right material for commentary, and they just completely whiffed it. So fast forward to 2016, Green Day, they got a new album out, and look, when I got my copy early, I almost didn't even want to listen to it. In a year where so many pop-punk bands like Blink-182 have struggled for relevance, I'm not sure I could take Green Day screwing it up yet again, and they were significantly older than those bands. Now that said, given how absolutely turgid and unstable 2016 has been in terms of politics this year, they've probably got the most fruitful material since the Bush administration, and I had to hope they at least do something interesting with Revolution Radio, so did they pull it off? Well, okay. I'm of a couple minds on this album, and how much you like it will really depend on how and why you're a fan of Green Day. If you're a diehard fan that was left wanting because of the trilogy, you're going to be thrilled and relieved by this album. You're probably going to love it. If you're a more critical Green Day fan coming out of the 90s, you might find this a little bit underwhelming, as if Green Day is just running out of ideas and simply returning back to the barrel again to mine for what works. If you're not a Green Day fan, you won't care about any of this, but for me, having re-examined their entire career before listening to this album a good 8 to dozen times, I'm not going to say this is a great Green Day album or anything close to their best, but it is a return to form, albeit one that feels a little bit safer than I'd like to see, or it probably should be. It definitely has its moments and will probably do a fair bit to win back fans from the trilogy, but the band has done a lot better with more ambition, and there's a part of me that feels that the deliberately smaller scope might be going backwards for this group, and I don't just mean in terms of their sound. So instead of my usual review template, let's return to my 3 general rules when it comes to making political art, the 3 Ps, because make no mistake, Green Day, they're punks, they are trying to make some statements with this album, even if they are as direct yet scattershot as usual. We'll get back to that lack of precision in a second, but the other 2 Ps are power and populism, which is where Green Day has tended to do very well across their entire careers. In the former case, it's all about presentation and invective, and Billy Joe Armstrong is certainly not phoning it in as a singer. Almost analogous to Garth Brooks, his voice has lost some of its raw dynamic range in both the high and the low end, but he still has the volume and conviction to match his instrumentation, which you can describe as really rather very meat and potatoes by Green Day standards, for better or for worse. Now, there are a few places where the band does venture into some newer territory. The opening track, Somewhere Now, falls midway between the breezy tunes of mid-90s REM and the poo worship that Green Day have indulged over the past decade, and I'm not complaining about that. Then you have the choppy, lumbering riffs of Say Goodbye that have got a little bit more heft than you would normally expect in a modern Green Day song. The opening of Too Dumb to Die gets a little bit noisier with a distant, rattling riff, and Troubled Times picks up some bassy rattle before the hook smashes on through. And that's the thing. Regardless of any sort of bass or guitar embellishment on the verses, eventually it's all gonna come back to that straightforward hook that works the loud, soft dynamic until it bleeds. And look, for the most part, I don't have any problem with that. I take Green Day actually writing a melody for its hook or a solo that can actually stick in your memory over the majority of modern pop music where you're lucky to get a melodic hook in the instrumental at all. But the problem comes, if you're a hardcore Green Day fan or you've heard a lot of their music, you've heard all of this before and probably done a fair bit better. One of the reasons I like 21st Century Breakdown and Warning is that while they had their punk anthems that were pretty straightforward, they also took more chances with the sonic palette and production. They didn't always work, but more often than not, they did stick the landing. This album, it doesn't quite take those chances, and where that's all the more apparent is in the lyrics. And I'll say this for Green Day, at their best, they've always aimed to be populist in their writing. Speak for the disaffected American youth who see the world flying out of control and they can't do anything about it. It's why on this album, songs like Troubled Times and the title track actually have a little bit of staying power. And for a sheer party anthem bouncing off the walls, it's a lot of fun. It's got that populist vibe. But for as much as Billy Joe Armstrong has the firepower and the drive to want to talk about the more incendiary topics, he doesn't really have focus. He wants to talk about government surveillance and international aggression and internal instability and Black Lives Matter and the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, but instead of focusing on these issues or telling a story about these issues or getting into the meat and complexity of these issues, he instead engages in what I would call, or what Nathan Rabin had called, the Spike Lee approach to politics. The sort where he would wake up, read the morning paper, see a slew of disconnected issues that make him really angry, and then rail about all of them all at once, which unfortunately tends to blend them into a white-hot noise and can kind of diminish the actual impact of these issues, not to mention diminish some of the populism. Bang Bang is probably the closest to actually having focus, written from the perspective of a glory-seeking shooter, but again, we've seen this, and it's no peacemaker if we're being honest. But even this, again, this sort of scattershot approach, it's not new for Green Day. Hell, that was one of the biggest underlying criticisms of 21st Century Breakdown. But then again, the thesis of that record was a search for clarity for its two abstract protagonists in a world that was deteriorating rapidly around them. So the overloaded panic and confusion, the clusterfuck of issues kind of worked. But even then, certain songs did actually have an individual focus. See East Jesus Nowhere or Peacemaker. Whereas on Revolution Radio, the political messages are juxtaposed to Billy Joe Armstrong's personal demons, most of which focus on being an aging punk who is questioning whether or not it was all worth it, with a fair amount of nostalgia looking back to the time when it was better. Hell, as much as I like bouncing off the walls, it's really a trip back to an easier, wilder time. Same with Outlaws or the teenage love song Youngblood, which I can't take remotely seriously because the title reminds me of that god-awful comic series from the 90s, which is exactly what happens when you aim to trigger that sort of nostalgia. You get the better, but you also get the worst side of it. I'd argue part of this questioning that comes through on Too Dumb to Die and Still Alive. He's fresh out of rehab. There's songs where Billy Joe Armstrong is coming to grips with the fact that while he did live fast, he didn't die young. And the What Now is a genuine shocker for him now that it's crystallizing the most in Forever Now. A song that's a mishmash of three distinctive songs, and you can kind of tell. It's trying to do the whole American Idiot thing, and really it does not click. And yet, despite all of that myopia, there is one genuinely inspired choice on this record on by far its best song. The closer, Ordinary World, is a stripped-back acoustic number, one we haven't heard from Green Day in quite some time. It's wistful, it's underplayed, and it's from the perspective of what could have happened if Billy Joe Armstrong and Green Day had never actually made it. And yet, despite presenting a story that didn't actually happen, it's a far more emotionally honest and mature song than you would ever expect from this band. And it really does get to the roots of the suburban populism that's always been at the heart of Green Day's music and why it's always had so much power for me. Just grown up this time. Even if they never left suburbia, the earnest emotion is still there. The pathos is there. If Revolution Radio had been written from this more mature, more weathered perspective that probably reflects a lot more reality for Billy Joe Armstrong, it might have had more gravity and pathos, more empathy that we can actually connect with this music. And yet, even despite the amount of heavy lifting that song does to lend broader context to the rest of the album, try to place it from that point of view, I wish I liked this album a lot more. Because make no mistake, mistake, it's definitely a step up from the trilogy, and you could argue that going forward, it's a chance for Green Day to tell new stories in a new chapter of their lives. And yeah, at the end of the day, I'm still a real fan of this band, but at the same time, this record is not treading new ground lyrically or instrumentally, and the scattershot approach to its message doesn't really do it a lot of favors, especially in comparison with how Green Day handled such an approach in the past. If it wasn't for Ordinary World, I probably would have come down a lot harder on this album, but at the same time, I can't deny that even if Green Day has a formula, sort of like AC/DC does, it's a good formula. And again, Ordinary World is absolutely excellent. It's got serious year-end potential for me. And as such, I'm giving this record an extremely light 7 out of 10, and a recommendation. If you're a Green Day fan, you're probably gonna like, but not really love this, especially in comparison with their larger discography. And if you're not a Green Day fan, you've long ago stopped caring, and this won't change anything. Right now, I just hope this album is the transition back to a more mature and innovative Green Day that I've missed for quite some time. It's a good first step, it's going in the right direction, but I want to hear that next step, so check this out in the meantime. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I got the poll up here. I can imagine this Green Day review might leave some divided opinions, because I know some people are really hot on it, but I've also seen a lot of critical press that's been kind of ambivalent to mixed on it, so we'll see where you guys line out in this. Anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation? I'm all ears. My list of albums to cover is still pretty stacked at this moment. I'll be trying to get through as many as I can. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.